He had the face of an angel and the soul of a predator. In the early hours of February 3, 1972, in a modest hardware store located in the quiet Buenos Aires suburb of Tigre, two bodies lay sprawled on the cold concrete floor. The store was silent except for the faint crackle of cooling metal and the distant wail of approaching sirens that would soon shatter the night. One of the bodies belonged to a night watchman, a working-class man in his middle years who had simply been doing his job, keeping the premises safe, earning an honest living to support his family. He had been shot twice. He was dead before he hit the ground. The second body told a far more disturbing story. It was an 18-year-old boy named Hector Somoza, and his death was not quick or clean. His face had been burned off with a blowtorch, the skin and muscle tissue melting away until his features were completely unrecognizable. His hands had received the same treatment. Whoever killed him had gone to extraordinary, grotesque lengths to erase his identity, to make absolutely certain that no one could determine who he was by looking at him. Standing over these two corpses, only moments before fleeing into the night, was the killer. He was 20 years old. He had soft, curly hair, delicate features, and a baby face that made him look younger than his years. People who knew him often remarked that he looked like an angel, innocent, cherubic, incapable of harm. But that angelic appearance concealed something monstrous. They would call him El Ángel Negro, the Black Angel. Some would call him El Ángel de la Muerte, the Angel of Death. Both names captured the terrible contradiction at the heart of his story. A killer whose beauty masked his brutality. His real name was Carlos Eduardo Robledo Puch. In the span of less than 10 months, this young man had committed at least 11 murders, 17 armed robberies, 2 kidnappings, multiple sexual assaults, and countless other violent crimes. He had shot a 10-month-old baby girl in her cradle and, by sheer luck, missed. He had kidnapped 2 young women off the streets of Buenos Aires, sexually assaulted them, and then executed them with bullets to the back while they ran desperately for their lives. He had sat beside the corpse of a 61-year-old watchman he had just murdered and calmly drank an entire bottle of whiskey in celebration. He had killed for money. He had killed for thrills. He had killed for no reason at all. And according to every psychological evaluation conducted over the next 50 years, he had felt absolutely nothing. No guilt, no remorse, no empathy whatsoever. But on this night, February 3, 1972, Carlos Robledo Puch made one fatal, catastrophic mistake. In his panic to conceal the identity of his accomplice, whose body he had just mutilated with a blowtorch, he forgot one critical detail. Hector Somoza still had Puch's own identification card tucked in his pants pocket. That single oversight would bring his reign of terror to an abrupt end. 24 hours later, police would arrest him. He would confess to everything, willingly, eagerly, in disturbing detail. And he would spend the next 53 years, and counting, behind bars, making him the longest-serving prisoner in all of South America. Today, in December 2025, Carlos Eduardo Robledo Puch is 73 years old. He has never shown genuine remorse for his crimes. He has repeatedly demanded to be executed by lethal injection, even though Argentina abolished the death penalty decades ago. He has been diagnosed by multiple forensic psychiatrists as a psychopath with narcissistic omnipotence, paranoia, megalomaniac ideation, and a complete and permanent lack of empathy. This is his complete story. every detail, every victim, every lie, every moment of horror. This is the story of the Black Angel, Argentina's most infamous teenage serial killer and one of the most chilling criminal cases in South American history. To truly understand Carlos Robledo Puch and the crimes he committed, it is essential to understand the Argentina he was born into and the turbulent era in which his killing spree unfolded. The late 1960s and early 1970s were years of profound chaos, violence, and political instability in Argentina. The country had not known stable democratic governance for years. Since the military coup of 1955, which overthrew President Juan Perón, Argentina had been caught in a relentless cycle of military dictatorships interrupted only by brief, fragile periods of civilian rule. Political violence was not just common, it was endemic. Left-wing guerrilla groups like the Montoneros and the ERP, People's Revolutionary Army, were waging an armed insurgency against the state, carrying out kidnappings, bombings, and assassinations of military officers, politicians, and businessmen. On the other side, right-wing death squads and military forces were responding with brutal repression, disappearances, and torture. The stage was being set for what would later be known as Argentina's Dirty War, a campaign of state terrorism that would claim the lives of tens of thousands of people between 1976 and 1983. In May 1970, just a year before Carlos's killing spree began, the Montoneros kidnapped and executed former President Pedro Eugenio Aramburu in a highly publicized operation that shocked the nation and marked the beginning of an even darker chapter in Argentina's history. By 1971, Buenos Aires was a powder keg. Bombings were frequent, kidnappings were routine, assassinations were almost expected. The military was preparing to seize power once again, and the entire country seemed to be teetering on the edge of civil war. But in the quiet, tree-lined, middle-class suburbs of northern Buenos Aires, places like Olivos, Vicente Lopez, and Tigre, a different kind of terror was taking shape. It was quieter, more personal, and entirely disconnected from the political violence that dominated the headlines. This terror had nothing to do with ideology, revolution, or the struggle between left and right. It had nothing to do with politics at all. It was driven purely by a teenage psychopath with a gun, an insatiable appetite for violence, and an absolute void where empathy and conscience should have been. His name was Carlos Eduardo Robledo Puch, and his crimes would shock a nation already numb from years of bloodshed. Carlos Eduardo Robledo Puch was born on January 19, 1952, in Buenos Aires, the capital city of Argentina. His birth certificate listed his full name and the names of his parents: Victor Robledo Puch, a former technician employed by the American automotive giant General Motors, and Josefa Aida Habendak, a German immigrant who had arrived in Argentina shortly after the devastation of the Second World War. The Puch family was not wealthy, but they were respectable and, on paper at least, unremarkable. What set them apart, however, was their lineage. The Puch family traced its ancestry back to some of Argentina's most distinguished historical figures. They were descendants of Dionisio Puch, who had served as governor of Salta province in the 19th century, and Martín Miguel de Güemes, a celebrated military leader and hero of Argentina's War of Independence, who had fought against Spanish colonial forces and died defending his homeland. Despite this proud and aristocratic heritage, the family lived a modest, middle-class life. In 1956, when Carlos was just 4 years old, the Puches moved from Buenos Aires to a rented apartment on Borges Street in the neighborhood of Olivos, a quiet, working-class area in the municipality of Vicente Lopez, just north of the capital. Their home was on the first floor of a building, and directly below them, on the ground floor, was a hardware store. It was an ordinary living arrangement, typical of many families in the area. But the irony is almost poetic, almost too perfect to be coincidence. 16 years later, Carlos Robledo Puch would commit his final murder in a hardware store, ending his killing spree in the same type of building he had lived above as a child. As a child, Carlos appeared to be gentle, introspective, and quiet. He was shy, much like his mother, and preferred solitary activities to loud, boisterous play. He studied piano, showing a modest talent for music. He learned to speak German fluently, a skill passed down from his mother's immigrant background. He loved football, Argentina's national obsession, and was a devoted supporter of River Plate, one of the country's most popular and successful clubs. To his neighbors, to his teachers, and to anyone who encountered him during those early years, Carlos Robledo Puch seemed like a perfectly ordinary middle-class Argentine boy. He had soft, curly hair, delicate features, and an innocent, almost angelic face. People often remarked on how beautiful he was, how gentle he seemed. Some said he looked like a cherub, like a child from a Renaissance painting. But beneath that innocent, angelic exterior, something was profoundly, dangerously wrong. The boy who looked like an angel was already beginning to show the early signs of a personality disorder that would later be diagnosed as psychopathy, a complete absence of empathy, remorse, and the capacity for genuine human connection. The warning signs appeared early, though at the time they were not recognized for what they truly were, the first cracks in a developing psychopath's mask. Carlos regularly stole from his classmates at school. At first, these were small, seemingly insignificant thefts, pens, coins, small personal items that could easily be dismissed as the mischief of a curious or troubled child. But the thefts were deliberate, calculated, and showed no sign of guilt or remorse when he was caught. At the same time, Carlos was also a victim. He was frequently bullied by other boys at school. They saw him as weak, effeminate, different from the other boys. They mocked him. They targeted him. They beat him. For a boy who was already emotionally isolated and struggling to connect with others, this bullying only deepened his sense of alienation and resentment. His relationship with his father was cold, distant, and devoid of warmth or affection. There was no bond, no connection, no emotional support. Years later, this rift would turn into pure, murderous hatred. Carlos would threaten to kill his father the day he was released from prison, and the two would never reconcile. In 1967, when Carlos was 15 years old, the thefts escalated. He was caught stealing money from the school secretary's office, a blatant, brazen theft from an authority figure. This was not the act of a confused or troubled teenager experimenting with minor misbehavior. This was deliberate theft, carried out with planning and intent. The school expelled him immediately. 1 year later, in December 1968, the 16-year-old Carlos walked into a bicycle workshop in his neighborhood and calmly stole a motorcycle. When police arrested him shortly afterward, he did something that shocked the officers. He confessed not only to that theft, but to more than 14 additional robberies he had already committed. He did so without hesitation, without fear, and without any apparent concern for the consequences. A juvenile court judge sent Carlos to a reformatory where he was held for 20 days under court order. For most teenagers, this would be a wake-up call, a moment to reflect on their actions, to change course, to avoid a life of crime. For Carlos Robledo Puch, it meant nothing. He walked out of that reformatory the exact same person who had walked in, a thief, a liar, a manipulator, and a budding sociopath with no empathy, no remorse, and no fear of consequences. The pattern was set. The trajectory was clear. All that remained was for Carlos to find the right partner, someone who would push him over the edge from theft into violence, from breaking rules into taking lives. In late 1969 or early 1970, Carlos Robledo Puch met a young man who would change the trajectory of his life forever. His name was Jorge Antonio Ibáñez. Ibáñez was older than Carlos, more experienced in the world of crime, and willing to take bigger, more dangerous risks. He wore his hair long, in stark contrast to Carlos's short, curly locks, and he had a swagger and confidence that Carlos lacked. The two young men quickly formed a partnership. It was intense, secretive, and built on mutual risk and a shared appetite for criminal thrills. There have been persistent rumors, never formally confirmed in court records, but widely speculated upon in Argentine media and later dramatized in film, that the bond between Puch and Ibáñez was not only criminal, but also romantic. Argentine newspapers at the time hinted at a possible sexual relationship between the two. Years later, filmmaker Luis Ortega would interpret their partnership as a gay love story when he adapted Puch's crimes into the 2018 film El Ángel, a visually stunning but controversial work that romanticized the killer and his accomplice. Whether the relationship was romantic or not, the bond between Carlos and Jorge was undeniable. It was intense, codependent, and ultimately deadly. Together, Puch and Ibáñez embarked on a series of armed robberies in early 1971. They were not petty thieves anymore. They were serious criminals, stealing millions of pesos from businesses across Buenos Aires province, and they spent the money lavishly, indulging in a lifestyle far beyond their means. They bought expensive designer clothes, they ate at fine restaurants, they stayed in luxury hotels, they drove stolen or flashy cars through the streets of Buenos Aires, moving like young princes of crime, untouchable and invincible. In January 1971, the law briefly caught up with them. Both were arrested and charged with serious felonies, but they were released on bail shortly afterward, ordered to appear in court at a later date. Instead of showing up for their court appearance, Puch and Ibáñez made a decision that would seal their fate. They boarded a train and fled to Mar del Plata, a coastal resort city southeast of Buenos Aires, far from the reach of the Buenos Aires police. They were on the run. They were free. They had money, weapons, and no fear of consequences, and they were about to cross a line that neither of them had crossed before. They were about to become killers. The night of May 3rd, 1971, changed everything. It was the night Carlos Robledo Puch committed his first murder, and it set in motion a killing spree that would terrorize Buenos Aires for the next 9 months. Just after midnight, Carlos and Jorge Ibáñez entered an auto repair shop in Vicente López, a quiet neighborhood in the northern suburbs of Buenos Aires. Inside, they found the shop's owner, a middle-aged man working late. His wife was there as well, and in a cradle nearby, their 10-month-old baby daughter slept peacefully, unaware of the nightmare that was about to unfold. What happened next was brutal beyond comprehension, an act of violence so senseless and cruel that it defies rational explanation. Carlos raised his gun and shot the shop owner, killing him instantly. The man's wife screamed in terror and grief. Carlos turned to her and opened fire, hitting her multiple times. She collapsed to the floor, bleeding profusely, critically wounded but still clinging to life. And then, while she lay helpless and bleeding on the ground, unable to defend herself or call for help, she was sexually assaulted. Years later, the woman, who survived her injuries but was too ill to testify in court, provided a description of her attacker. She said that the man who raped and shot her had long hair, which matched the appearance of Jorge Ibáñez, not Carlos Robledo Puch, who wore his hair short and curly. But the truth of who committed the sexual assault remains murky and disputed. What is absolutely certain is that both men were present in that auto shop. Both participated in the robbery. Both were armed, and both are responsible for what happened next. Before fleeing with 400,000 Argentine pesos in cash, Carlos looked down at the baby's cradle. The infant was crying now, terrified by the gunfire and the screaming. Carlos raised his gun. He aimed it directly at the 10-month-old child, and he fired. The bullet struck the cradle, missing the baby by inches. She was unharmed. Carlos and Jorge fled into the night, leaving behind a dead man, a critically injured woman fighting for her life, and a baby who would grow up never knowing how close she came to being murdered at 10 months old. Carlos Robledo Puch was 19 years old. He had just committed his first murder, and according to every psychological evaluation conducted over the next 5 decades, he felt absolutely nothing. No guilt, no remorse, no horror at what he had done. Only 11 days later, on the night of May 14, 1971, Puch and Ibáñez struck again. This time, their target was a nightclub in Olivos, another neighborhood in the northern suburbs of Buenos Aires. They broke in under cover of darkness, moving silently through the empty building. They located the storage room where the club's cash was kept and stole more than 2 million pesos. It was a massive haul, enough money to keep them living comfortably for weeks or even months. As they prepared to leave, Carlos noticed an open door leading to a small room. Curious, he peered inside. 2 men were sleeping, the nightclub's watchmen. They were unarmed. They were asleep. They posed absolutely no threat whatsoever. They had not seen the robbers. They did not know a crime had even been committed. Carlos and Jorge had already secured the money and could have simply walked away unnoticed. But Carlos raised his weapon and opened fire, killing both men where they lay. There was no reason to kill them, no tactical advantage, no self-defense, no financial gain. They had already stolen the money. Carlos killed them simply because he could, because the opportunity was there, and because taking human life had become something he enjoyed. This was the moment Carlos Robledo Puch stopped being a thief and became a serial killer. This was the moment when murder became not a means to an end, but an end in itself. 10 days later, on May 24, 1971, Puch and Ibáñez entered a supermarket in Vicente Lopez. Inside, they encountered a 61-year-old night watchman, an older man working the graveyard shift to make ends meet. Carlos shot him dead without saying a single word, without hesitation, without giving the man any chance to surrender or plead for his life. They then stole more than 5 million pesos from the supermarket safe. And then they did something that reveals the true depth of Carlos Robledo Puch's depravity, something that shows beyond any doubt that his crimes were no longer about money or survival. They were about power, control, and the perverse pleasure he derived from violence. They sat down, right there in the supermarket, with the 61-year-old watchman's corpse still warm on the floor beside them, and they opened a bottle of whiskey and drank it together. It was a toast, a celebration, a ritual performed over a dead body. They laughed, they drank, they enjoyed themselves as if they had just accomplished something worthy of pride rather than committed an act of senseless murder. This wasn't robbery anymore. This wasn't even murder for profit. This was entertainment. This was pleasure. This was evil in its purest, most undiluted form. By mid-June 1971, Carlos Robledo Puch had killed at least 5 people, but his most horrific, most disturbing crimes were still to come. On the night of June 13, 1971, Puch and Ibáñez were driving along Avenida del Libertador, one of Buenos Aires' main thoroughfares, when they spotted a 16-year-old girl leaving a bowling alley. The girl was involved in street prostitution, vulnerable, alone, and an easy target. They pulled over. They forced her into the car at gunpoint. Carlos drove while Jorge climbed into the back seat with the terrified girl. And there, in the back seat of the moving car, Jorge raped her. It remains unclear whether Carlos also participated in the sexual assault, though he was certainly present and complicit. When they were finished, they drove her to a desolate stretch of the Pan-American Highway, far from any witnesses or help. They ordered her out of the car. Carlos told her to walk away, to keep moving forward, and to not look back. She obeyed. Barefoot, terrified, traumatized, she walked. She didn't dare turn around. She just kept moving forward, probably praying that they would let her live. And then Carlos raised his gun and shot her 5 times in the back. She was 16 years old. She died alone on a dark highway, murdered in cold blood after being kidnapped and raped by 2 young men who felt nothing. 11 days later, on June 24, 1971, Puch and Ibáñez committed an almost identical crime. This time their victim was a 22-year-old woman who had just left her boyfriend's house in Vicente Lopez, not far from where the 16-year-old girl had been murdered. They kidnapped her at gunpoint and drove her to another isolated area on the Pan-American Highway. Jorge attempted to rape her, but this woman fought back. She resisted with everything she had. For her resistance, for her courage, for daring to fight for her own life, she was thrown half naked from the car. Jorge ordered her to run. Carlos followed her out of the vehicle, and as she ran, desperate, terrified, fighting for her life, he shot her multiple times in the back, killing her. 2 young women, abducted from the streets of Buenos Aires, sexually assaulted, executed, and Carlos Robledo Puch felt nothing. On August 5, 1971, the partnership between Carlos Robledo Puch and Jorge Antonio Ibáñez came to a sudden, violent, and mysterious end. The official story is simple and straightforward. They were in a car together when Carlos, who was driving, crashed. Jorge Ibáñez was killed on impact. Carlos walked away from the wreckage without a scratch. A tragic accident, a twist of fate. Bad luck, or so Carlos claims. But many people, including investigators, journalists, and even members of the general public, have questioned this version of events for decades. Was it really an accident? Or did Carlos Robledo Puch deliberately kill his accomplice and stage the crash as a cover-up? There are several reasons to be suspicious. By August 1971, Puch and Ibáñez had committed at least 7 murders together, multiple sexual assaults, and countless armed robberies. They were wanted by police. The heat was on, Every day they remained free, the risk of capture increased. Some have speculated that Carlos saw Jorge as a liability, someone who knew too much, someone who could turn on him if arrested, someone whose testimony could send Carlos to prison for life. Others believe that Jorge may have wanted out, that he was becoming uncomfortable with the escalating violence, and that Carlos couldn't allow him to leave. Still others point to the rumored romantic relationship between the two and suggest jealousy, betrayal, or a lover's quarrel as a possible motive. We may never know the truth. What we do know is that Jorge Antonio Ibáñez, who had participated in at least 7 murders, multiple sexual assaults, and countless robberies, was dead at the scene. And Carlos Robledo Puch, freed from his partner, wasted no time finding a replacement. Héctor Somoza was only 18 years old when he became Carlos Robledo Puch's second accomplice. Whether Somoza knew the full extent of Puch's crimes when he first agreed to work with him is unclear. What is certain is that he was about to become part of a killing spree that would end in his own brutal, horrifying death. Their first crime together occurred on November 15, 1971, when they broke into a supermarket in the northern area of Greater Buenos Aires. Inside, Carlos was surprised by a 50-year-old watchman. Without hesitation, Carlos shot him multiple times, killing him. They fled without taking anything, leaving the watchman's body behind. Another watchman, another senseless murder, another family destroyed. 2 days later, on November 17, 1971, Puch and Somoza broke into an auto agency and stole 90,000 Argentine pesos. Before leaving, Carlos found the sleeping watchman, a man who, according to some accounts, had recently told his family that he was worried about the recent spate of murders targeting watchmen and security guards in the area. His fears were justified. His concerns were tragically prescient. Carlos shot him dead. On November 25, 1971, Puch and Somoza broke into a Dodge car dealership and stole approximately 1.5 million pesos. Carlos took the watchman to the second floor of the building, away from prying eyes and potential witnesses. He shot him 3 times, killing him. By this point, police were beginning to connect the dots. They were hunting for a serial killer, or possibly a small group of killers who specifically targeted night watchmen and security guards across Buenos Aires province. They had patterns, ballistics, and crime scene similarities. What they did not yet have was a name, a face, or a suspect. But they were about to get all 3. February 3rd, 1972, was the night Carlos Robledo Puch's killing spree came crashing to an end. It was the night everything fell apart. It was the night he made the mistake that would lead to his arrest, his conviction, and the rest of his life behind bars. Carlos and Héctor Somoza broke into a hardware store in Tigre, a quiet neighborhood in Buenos Aires. It was the same type of building Carlos had lived above as a child, an eerie echo of his past. Inside, they encountered the night watchman. Carlos forced the man into a small room at gunpoint and locked the door. The watchman begged for his life, pleaded to be spared, but his words fell on deaf ears. Carlos walked away, leaving the man locked inside. Minutes later, he returned. He opened the door, and he shot the watchman twice, killing him. After the murder, Puch and Somoza turned their attention to the store's safe. They struggled with it. They couldn't get it open. Frustration mounted. Tension filled the air. And then something happened, something that would end Héctor Somoza's life and seal Carlos Robledo Puch's fate. According to Carlos's later testimony, Somoza suddenly grabbed him from behind. In Carlos's mind, this could only mean one thing. Somoza was trying to kill him, to take all the money for himself. In a flash of panic and rage, Carlos pulled out his handgun and shot Somoza in the chest, killing him instantly. But Carlos didn't stop there. In a frenzied, desperate attempt to conceal Somoza's identity and delay the police investigation, Carlos retrieved a blowtorch from the hardware store. He turned it on and applied the flame directly to Hector Somoza's face, burning away the skin and muscle tissue until his features were completely unrecognizable. He did the same to Somoza's hands, melting away the flesh that could be used for fingerprint identification. The smell of burning flesh filled the hardware store. Carlos grabbed some cash and fled into the night. But in his panic, in his haste, Carlos Robledo Puch made one fatal, catastrophic mistake. He forgot that Hector Somoza had Carlos's own identification card in his pants pocket. It was a tiny detail, an easily overlooked piece of evidence. But it was the detail that would end everything. On the morning of February 4th, 1972, police arrived at the hardware store in Tigre. They found two bodies. One was the watchman, shot twice, and left where he fell. The other was a young man whose face and hands had been burned beyond recognition, the flesh charred and melted in a grotesque attempt to erase his identity. When forensic investigators carefully searched the burned corpse, they found something lodged in the pants pocket. It was an identification card. The name on the card read, Carlos Eduardo Robledo Puch. Police immediately began cross-referencing the name with recent crimes. They interviewed Somoza's family, who confirmed that Hector had left the house with a young man named Carlos the night before and had not returned. That same day, February 4th, 1972, police arrested Carlos Eduardo Robledo Puch. He was 20 years old. He had murdered at least 11 people in less than 10 months. The Black Angel's reign of terror was finally over. After his arrest, Carlos Robledo Puch did something that shocked even experienced homicide detectives. He confessed, not reluctantly, not under duress or torture, willingly, eagerly even. He confessed to every murder, every robbery, every crime he had committed over the past 10 months. He even confessed to crimes that police hadn't yet connected to him. He provided dates, locations, methods, details that only the killer could know. He seemed almost proud, as if he were describing a series of accomplishments rather than confessing to serial murder. Years later, Argentine journalist Rodolfo Palacios, who would interview Puch extensively for his book El Ángel Negro, The Black Angel, described these confessions as chilling in their matter-of-fact tone. In their early meetings, Puch declared himself innocent, a victim of police brutality and judicial persecution. But in later interviews, he revealed the truth, admitting to the killings in disturbing detail. Palacios would later say that interviewing Puch took a severe psychological toll on him, that he began to see the world through the eyes of the victims and even through the eyes of the killer himself. The experience was so emotionally draining that it began to consume him. At one point, Puch told Palacios that when he got out of prison, he wanted to stay at Palacios's house and sleep on a mattress on the floor, a statement that made the journalist realize their relationship had crossed a dangerous line. The last message Palacios received from Puch was a threat delivered through another inmate. Tell that guy that when I get out of prison, I will shoot him 3 times. Palacios stopped writing about Puch after that, telling colleagues that the stories had vampirized him, draining his emotional and psychological resources. The charges against Carlos Eduardo Robledo Puch were staggering: 11 counts of aggravated murder, 1 attempted murder, 17 armed robberies, involvement in 1 rape and 1 attempted rape, 1 count of sexual abuse, 2 kidnappings, and 2 thefts. Forensic psychiatrists who examined Puch during this period described him as psychopathic, manipulative, and perverse. But the trial, the moment when Carlos Robledo Puch would face justice in a public courtroom, would not begin for another 8 long years. On July 7, 1973, more than a year after his arrest, but still years before his trial would begin, Carlos Robledo Puch escaped from the Penal de Olmos prison near La Plata. For 64 hours, he was free, wandering the streets of Buenos Aires like a ghost from Argentina's recent nightmare. He returned to Olivos, the neighborhood where he had grown up, perhaps looking for something he had lost, perhaps simply wanting to feel the sensation of freedom one last time. 3 days later, police recaptured him in downtown Buenos Aires. He was returned to prison, and he would never escape again. On August 4, 1980, more than 8 years after his arrest, Carlos Robledo Puch's trial finally began. He was now 28 years old, no longer the boyish teenager whose angelic face had shocked Argentina, but still youthful and defiant. He faced 36 charges, including 11 counts of aggravated murder. By this time, Carlos had completely changed his strategy. He now blamed Jorge Ibáñez for many of the murders, insisting that he himself had been framed or coerced. He stood defiant in court, calling the entire trial a Roman circus and claiming he had been judged and sentenced beforehand. The trial lasted 4 months. 92 witnesses testified against him, providing overwhelming evidence of his guilt. One of the most important figures in the proceedings was Dr. Osvaldo Raffo, a renowned forensic psychiatrist who had been tasked with evaluating Puch's mental state. Dr. Raffo met with Carlos over 25 times during the evaluation period. He conducted extensive psychological tests, interviews, and behavioral observations. His conclusion was clear and chilling. Carlos Robledo Puch was a psychopath who posed a serious and ongoing threat to society. Carlos later accused Dr. Raffo of lying and exploiting his case for personal fame and professional advancement. But Raffo's assessment would be echoed by every mental health professional who examined Puch over the next 4 decades. On November 27, 1980, the trial concluded. The 3 presiding judges delivered a unanimous verdict. Carlos Eduardo Robledo Puch was sentenced to life imprisonment with indeterminate reclusion, the maximum possible sentence under Argentine law at the time. After the verdict was read, Carlos stood and delivered his final statement to the court. "This was a Roman circus. I was judged and sentenced beforehand." He showed no remorse, no regret, no recognition of the suffering he had caused. He walked out of the courtroom the same person he was when he walked in, a remorseless killer who saw himself as the victim. The arrest and conviction of Carlos Robledo Puch destroyed his family utterly and completely. Shortly after his capture in 1972, his grandmother died suddenly, the shock and shame proving too much for her to bear. His mother, Josefa Aida Habendak, attempted suicide in the wake of the scandal. She survived, but the emotional and psychological damage was permanent. Carlos blamed his father for these tragedies. In a letter written shortly after his arrest, Carlos threatened to kill his father the day he was released from prison. The hatred was mutual. His father allegedly blamed Carlos for his grandmother's death and his mother's suicide attempt. Eventually, Carlos's father divorced his mother and was forced out of his job at General Motors due to the stigma, ostracization, and shame surrounding his son's crimes. The family was shattered, broken beyond repair. Over the years, Carlos's mother appeared in the media multiple times, defending her son and insisting he was innocent. In one particularly memorable confrontation with a journalist, she was asked directly, "Do you truly believe your son is innocent?" She responded, "I know that my son has done some things, but not all of them." It was the heartbreaking denial of a mother who could not or would not accept the monster her son had become. Carlos, meanwhile, showed no sympathy for his mother's suffering. According to a 2018 psychiatric evaluation, Puch blamed reporters for his mother's attempted suicide, not himself, not his crimes, but the media coverage. It was yet another example of his complete inability to accept responsibility for anything. In the years and decades following his conviction, Carlos Robledo Puch completely reversed his confession. He now claimed he had been tortured and coerced into admitting to the murders. He maintained that he was innocent of all the killings, though, curiously, he never denied the robberies, which were far less serious crimes. This selective denial would become a consistent pattern that lasted for more than 4 decades. In 2003, in one of the most bizarre incidents of his long imprisonment, Carlos dressed in a Batman costume and set fire to the workshop of the prison where he was being held in Olavarría, Buenos Aires province. He was briefly transferred to a psychiatric hospital for evaluation. After being found competent to face charges for the arson, he was returned to prison. In 2007, he was transferred to another facility in Azul, Buenos Aires. In April 2017, Carlos revealed to a journalist that in 1982, during the Falklands War between Argentina and the United Kingdom, he had written a personal letter to military leader Leopoldo Galtieri, volunteering to serve as a soldier and fight for Argentina. He never received a response. It remains unclear whether Carlos genuinely wanted to serve his country or whether he simply saw the war as an opportunity to escape prison and kill again. In July 2000, Carlos Robledo Puch became eligible for parole under Argentine law. He did not submit a petition. On May 27, 2008, he finally requested parole. The judge reviewing his case denied it, stating that Carlos remained a clear and present threat to society. In November 2013, Carlos made an extraordinary and disturbing request. He asked for a review of his sentence, or, if that was not possible, his execution by lethal injection. Argentina does not have the death penalty. It was abolished decades ago. The Supreme Court of Justice denied both requests. In March 2015, the Supreme Court rejected yet another appeal filed by Carlos against the denial of parole. In May 2019, he was rushed to a hospital from prison after showing signs of intoxication related to side effects of medication aimed at treating depression. In March 2023, during a television interview with the Argentine news network America 24, Carlos once again denied his crimes and blamed others. He said he was constantly suffering in prison. He said he wished to be euthanized. This demand for death, for execution, for euthanasia, has become a recurring theme in Carlos's later years. Psychologists believe it is yet another manipulation tactic, a way to portray himself as a victim rather than a perpetrator. In June 2023, Judge Oscar Roberto Quintana of the Court of Guarantees and Appeals denied Carlos's parole request once again. In his ruling, Judge Quintana cited that Carlos suffers from inconsistent emotions which could be expressed in an erratic way, and that he has paranoid reflections. Judge Quintana also rejected the possibility of transferring Carlos to a nursing home, noting that he refuses psychiatric treatment and has not worked since 1992. In November 2024, Judge Quintana offered Carlos a compromise: more relaxed prison conditions, including permission to leave the penitentiary for a few hours under supervision. Carlos rejected the proposal. He said he was used to living in prison. In March 2025, Carlos gave another interview where he once again demanded to be executed via lethal injection. He is 73 years old. He has spent 53 years in prison, and he still shows no remorse. Carlos Robledo Puch has been extensively evaluated by mental health professionals over the past 5 decades. The conclusions are consistent, chilling, and damning. In November 2024, a team of psychologists issued a comprehensive psychiatric profile of Carlos to Judge Quintana, who was considering whether to grant him full parole. The psychologists found him to be suffering from a psychopathic personality disorder characterized by significant narcissistic omnipotence, exacerbated self-value, complete lack of empathy, large amounts of repressed rage, emotional superficiality, impulsivity, absence of introspection, repressed emotionality, megalomaniac ideation, paranoia, and lack of self-control. Based on this profile, parole was denied. An earlier evaluation from October 2018 reached similar conclusions. Mental health professionals, including a psychiatrist and a psychologist specialized in cognitive behavioral therapy, determined that Carlos denies responsibility for his crimes, confessing only to the robberies. They described him as psychopathic, manipulating, cruel, and perverse. They also noted that he constantly refers to God to justify his current situation and continues to hold others responsible for his problems, including blaming reporters for his mother's attempted suicide. This is a man who has spent more than half a century in prison and has learned absolutely nothing. He has shown no growth, no insight, no remorse, no change whatsoever. Carlos Robledo Puch is the same person today that he was in 1972, a psychopathic killer with no empathy and no capacity for redemption. As of December 2025, Carlos Eduardo Robledo Puch has been imprisoned for 53 years and 10 months. This makes him the longest-serving prisoner in all of South America. He is 73 years old. He has spent nearly 3/4 of his life behind bars. In Argentina, approximately 4% of the prison population is serving life sentences. Carlos is among them, but unlike most, he has been denied parole repeatedly over decades. The reason is simple. Every psychiatric evaluation conducted over the past 5 decades has concluded that he remains a serious threat to society. And yet, despite more than 5 decades of incarceration, Carlos Robledo Puch remains exactly what he was in 1972, a remorseless killer who refuses to accept responsibility for the 11 lives he destroyed. In the decades of media coverage surrounding Carlos Robledo Puch, the films, the books, the interviews, the documentaries, the endless fascination with the killer's angelic face, one fact is often forgotten. 11 people lost their lives at his hands. 11 human beings with families, dreams, futures, and the fundamental right to live. Most were working-class men, night watchmen, security guards, shop owners, just trying to earn an honest living and support their families. They were killed for no reason other than the fact that they were there, in the wrong place, at the wrong time, when Carlos Robledo Puch decided to pull the trigger. 2 were young women, 16 and 22 years old, kidnapped from the streets of Buenos Aires, sexually assaulted, and executed while running for their lives. 1 was Hector Somoza, an 18-year-old boy whose face was burned beyond recognition with a blowtorch by the person he thought was his friend. 1 woman survived, the wife of the auto shop owner, shot multiple times and sexually assaulted on May 3, 1971. She lived, but she was forever scarred by what happened to her that night. Her 10-month-old baby daughter also survived, only because Carlos Robledo Puch's bullet missed her cradle by inches. That baby is now in her 50s. She has lived her entire life knowing that a serial killer tried to murder her when she was an infant. These are the people who deserve to be remembered, not the angel of death with his angelic face and decades of media attention, not the psychopath who demands execution and claims to be a victim, but the innocent lives he stole, the families he destroyed, the futures he erased. In 2018, Argentine director Luis Ortega released a film titled El Ángel, the Angel, loosely based on the crimes of Carlos Robledo Puch. The film starred Lorenzo Ferro as a fictionalized version of Carlos, renamed Carlitos in the screenplay. It depicted him as a beautiful, amoral young man drifting through crime with an almost childlike innocence and dreamlike detachment. The film was visually stunning. Sun-dappled cinematography, attractive young leads, a nostalgic 1970s aesthetic that made Buenos Aires look like a paradise rather than a crime scene. It also portrayed the relationship between Carlos and Jorge Ibáñez, renamed Ramon in the film, as a gay love story, complete with romantic longing and emotional intimacy. Director Luis Ortega told interviewers that he read between the lines of journalist Rodolfo Palacios's book El Ángel Negro and interpreted Carlos as being in love with his partner in crime. Ortega said he wanted to center the film on the love story more than the crime story. The film was highly controversial. Critics argued that it glamorized Carlos's crimes and romanticized a serial killer, turning a brutal murderer into a sympathetic anti-hero. They pointed out that the real Carlos Robledo Puch and Jorge Ibáñez didn't just kill 11 people, they raped 3 women and even shot a newborn baby. Director Luis Ortega admitted in interviews, "I don't like going to the movies to see people raping women, shooting them in the face. I wanted to adapt it to my world, my teenager experience." In other words, he deliberately chose to sanitize and romanticize the story, removing the most disturbing elements in order to create a more palatable, aesthetically pleasing film. Carlos himself was reportedly unhappy with the film, though he had no legal power to stop its release. El Ángel serves as a reminder of society's dangerous fascination with charismatic killers, a fascination that often overshadows the suffering of victims and the reality of evil. More than half a century after his arrest, Carlos Eduardo Robledo Puch remains an enigma wrapped in horror. Why did he kill? Was it for money? For power? For the thrill of taking life? For the sense of control it gave him over others? Psychiatrists have labeled him a psychopath, a narcissist, a manipulator. But labels do not explain the cold calculation with which he shot a 16-year-old girl 5 times in the back. They do not explain why he drank whiskey over the body of a 61-year-old watchman he had just murdered. They do not explain why he aimed his gun at a baby's cradle and pulled the trigger. Carlos Robledo Puch has spent decades denying his crimes. He has blamed others: Jorge Ibáñez, the police, the courts, reporters, even God. He has demanded death. He has rejected freedom. He once told a judge he was used to living in prison. Perhaps that is the truest statement Carlos Robledo Puch has ever made. He is a man who destroyed 11 lives, shattered countless families, and terrorized a city, all before his 21st birthday. And now, at 73 years old, he remains locked away in a cell somewhere in Buenos Aires province, the longest-serving prisoner in South America, a relic of a violent past that Argentina has never fully forgotten. A killer with an angel's face and a demon's heart. The story of Carlos Eduardo Robledo Puch is not simply the story of a serial killer. It is a story about evil, real, tangible, human evil. It is a story about the capacity for violence that exists within us all, and what happens when that capacity is unleashed without conscience, without empathy, without restraint. It is also a story about society's response to such evil, the fascination, the horror, the inability to look away, the romanticization of monsters in films and books and documentaries, the endless search for answers to questions that may have no answers. Carlos Robledo Puch will die in prison. He knows this. The courts know this. The Argentine people know this. And yet, he continues to fight, to demand execution, to claim innocence, to blame everyone but himself. Perhaps the most terrifying thing about Carlos Eduardo Robledo Puch is not what he did, but what he represents. The existence of people who look like us, who live among us, who seem perfectly normal, until the moment they reveal themselves to be something else entirely. The Black Angel, El Ángel Negro, the longest-serving prisoner in South America, the boy with the face of an angel and the heart of a killer. This is his story, complete, unvarnished, unforgettable. 53 years in prison, and he still shows no remorse. Should he ever be released? Tell us what you think in the comments.